Hello, I'm Sandra Viktorova. Thank you so much for joining us. Republicans dominated the state in the 2024 election, with President-elect Donald Trump easily winning, Senator Rick Scott cruising to re-election, and state Republicans keeping their supermajorities. Nearly 78% of registered Floridians voted this election. In Southwest Florida, voter turnout was even higher. In Lee and Collier counties, it reached 80% or higher. In Charlotte County, 79% of voters cast ballots, numbers not seen since the 1980s. For the third consecutive time, Florida voters selected President-elect Donald Trump to serve as commander-in-chief. The Trump-Vance ticket had 56% of the vote compared to 43% for Harris-Walz. Joining me now is FGCU political science professor Dr. Sandra Pavelka and WGCU Morning Edition host and reporter John Davis. Welcome to you both. Thank you for being here.
Thanks.
So let's start with this. We continue to watch Republicans solidify this domination across the state. John, I'll start with you. Were you surprised at the margins that we saw?
I don't think I was too surprised by the margins, but that's primarily because we've been seeing Republican registrations in Florida begin to come up with Democrats, and then in 2001, the number of registered Republicans in Florida actually outpaced the number of registered Democrats. But going back decades, that had not been the case. But given that Republicans now have a registration edge of more than 1 million voters, I wasn't too surprised.
We saw that obviously with the senator race, with Senator Scott, and with the state legislature, right?
Absolutely. So the state House and Senate, the Republican Party is going to continue to hold supermajorities in both of those chambers. And just looking specifically here in Southwest Florida, whether it was the state House or Senate, I didn't identify any races that were really competitive. It was almost across the board the case of an incumbent Republican facing a Democratic challenger. And, this place, even when Democrats did have a voter edge in Florida, Southwest Florida specifically had been a conservative stronghold even back then.
Dr. Pavelka, I wanted to ask you about this red wave we saw nationally. It was supposed to be so close. And that's not what we saw.
No, we did not. And this is historic because we haven't seen this since 1984, Reagan's second term. So this was something, kind of in the process and something coming that I don't think people really thought that it would have the impact it did in terms of the greatest extent that the Republicans came out to vote at all levels for president, House, Senate, and then, of course, in our case, the state legislature. But I think this goes along and aligns with the conservative values and conservative leanings that voters have now nationally. And it's aligning with their views on the economy, on immigration, and we saw it at the polls on Tuesday.
You just touched on it. That sort of driving force, does it all come back to the economy?
Well, from what I've seen in terms of the polls that I've seen kind of post-election, the economy had a really strong presence in this election, and it's being felt in voters' pocketbooks, and gas and groceries, if you would. Mm-hmm. And this was really, I think, heard at the national level, and something that, of course, Trump had been talking about for quite some time. And I read a poll that over 50%, a strong majority, were impacted by the economy moderately to highly, and that's significant.
Now, I would like to add, though, inflation has been going down. The White House was really excited about this consumer confidence index data that came out a week prior to the election. I actually spoke with the Biden White House economic advisor because they really wanted to get that message out. But that was one of the things I emphasized in my conversation with him is, are people really feeling this? When people go home and they're, budgeting for their own household and going to the grocery store, are they feeling that? And just to piggyback on what Dr. Pavelka was saying, I don't think they are. And that had a lot to do with how people made their choices when they went to the ballot box this time.
I want to ask you about any other surprises for you. This, we were talking about the red wave, perhaps was a surprise. Any other surprises this election?
Well, going back to Rick Scott's re-election victory, I wasn't surprised that he won, but I was surprised by his margin of victory because polls showed that this was going to be a much tighter race between him and his Democratic opponent, Debbie Mucarsel-Powell. But he won by a pretty wide margin. I was also surprised because Florida's senior voting bloc is so significant, and I'm sure you'll all remember Scott took a lot of flack, not just in Florida, but nationally, for a plan he had been pushing to sunset all federal programs after 5 years unless Congress renewed them. And that did not include any exceptions for entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare, which of course are very popular with that elder voting bloc. But at the end of the day, it didn't make a difference.
I'd like to turn now to the state amendments. Only 2 of these proposed amendments actually passed, of course, the right to hunt and then the adjustment to the homestead exemption, to deal with inflation. Some folks supporting some of the amendments, like abortion, marijuana, feel that the threshold was just too high, that they had the sense of, well, we got close to that 60%, perhaps is this threshold too high, that perhaps the will of the voters isn't being met?
Well, I think to understand that, you have to look at how these amendments get on the ballot in the first place. The 2 that passed that you were talking about, hunting and fishing and the homestead exemption, those were put on the ballot by legislative action. The more controversial ones were put there through citizen-led initiatives. So when an amendment gets on the ballot that way, it's kind of a rebuke of the legislature. It's saying, you're not doing what we want you to do through the normal legislative process, so putting this amendment before all the voters of the state is our only recourse.
Yeah, and actually, when we look at this supermajority, if you would, there was actually an initiative a couple years ago to actually increase it to 2/3. So I don't know that we're ever going to see that reduced like some states have, but we may even see it increase. So, but my opinion, the Constitution is kind of like our Bible, where only certain things should be held in our Constitution. And as you said, John, really it's up to the legislature. The legislature isn't really meeting the voters and their priorities, including marijuana and the abortion issue. Now, we did see this with medicinal marijuana several years ago, and it didn't pass the one time, but then it passed the
again.
second time with a lot of financial resources, obviously, backing it. But I don't think that we're going to certainly see these go away. These 2 initiatives in terms of marijuana and abortion will be back.
Right.
Agreed.
So talking about abortion and pot, those were 2 issues for the Governor Ron DeSantis. And I'm wondering, what you think, being that both of those amendments were defeated, the governor is now able to say, I beat the abortion amendment, I beat recreational marijuana in the state. What do you think this does for his sort of national profile?
Well, I don't think it hurts. Obviously, I think, I don't know for sure, but I think DeSantis may have further political aspirations following his governorship. But this can't hurt because he really took a strong stand in both cases. And in some cases, being controversial, really kind of not separating church and state in some of these actions. But it worked. So he was very successful in his campaigns.
I think voters' memories are going to play a big key into this as well. It wasn't that long ago that DeSantis was in a pretty bitter political battle seeking the Republican nomination for president against Donald Trump, who is now the president-elect. They have since mended fences publicly, but Trump did turn a lot of people off to DeSantis on the campaign trail just 10 months or so ago.
To add one in, what is the big takeaway now for Democrats who, this was a pretty brutal election. What is the big takeaway on both the national level and statewide?
Well, I think Democrats have to regroup. Obviously, Biden stepping down from his candidacy really hurt them. And with all due respect to Harris, she really picked up the ball and moved forward. She only had a couple months to really impress upon the American people why she should be president. And so she only had a couple months versus if we look at Trump, he's been campaigning for last probably decade. So, but I think this is an opportunity for Democrats to regroup and reprioritize. In Florida, not sure how much success they'll have, excuse me, at a regional or state level, because we are so hardcore red now. But across the country, nationally, there's still time. Obviously, we go through these kind of waxes and wanes and in politics, but certainly the red wave of the 2024 election was impactful.
Well, and remember the
Closing
2020,
thoughts, John?
Well, just remembering the 2022 midterm election, they talked about a red wave that didn't happen nationally, but it did here in Florida. And then we just saw that repeated in 2024. Democrats hold no statewide elected office, again, supermajorities in both legislative chambers. So the Democratic Party has got a lot of work ahead of it if it's going to really remain competitive and have much of an impact.
Dr. Pavelka, John, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.